In his seminal work, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, The Decline of the West, Spengler speaks of the two distinct phases within the organic historicity of a society. The first is the Kultur phase of intense artistic and metaphysical formation of that society's conception of the world. Once the idea is adequately conceptualized through art, architecture, and other creative expressions, we then enter a civilizational phase, wherein urban values and bourgeois notions begin to take over. Philosophy ossifies as its cultural zenith. All its energy is subsequently poured into a capitalismus. The West, or Abendland, is to Spengler a Faustian civilization, whose transition from cultural to civilizational phase had been personified by Napoleon. When he talks of Napoleon's aims, he sees it in a degenerative state, a desire to co-opt the mercantilist imperial framework begun by the British. From here on out, we enter what Spengler deems the irretrievably materialist civilizational stage. British history and the zenith of empire is nothing to Spengler but the grotesque vision, the tawdry cheapness of the world, as Pound would put it. We must remember, then, that Spengler writes and publishes his work in the environs of the Great War. His Germany, one where school children are taught the slogan Gott strafe England. He had lived through the severing of the ties between the two nations in the preceding decades. With the defeat and subsequent death of a Joseph Chamberlain figure, there had come an end to the dream of an Anglo-German alliance, and Spengler would find agreement in the sentiment expressed by Chamberlain that the German and English races were linked by the Anglo-Saxon root of the English people. But for Spengler, peering out beyond the Channel from his Rhenish vantage point, England seemed a secure island fortress, wherein the Saxon mindset, content with its own security, began to develop rational empiricism from Locke through Hume and so on, from the Enlightenment. Such was its force that Spengler was inclined to think that the English branch of Faustian civilization had never had a culture phase, that Britain's empire is but a natural consolidation of commercial trading positions, which stemmed out from the island like a network, and the island itself comprised merely of the individuals within it. But Spengler was postulating from within a German school of thought, an inheritance of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And it is from Nietzsche that Spengler takes the notion of Socrates as theoretical man, the analytical thinker, and sees this in the English he has encountered and concludes that she, England, is thus a fallen creature from the Nietzschean Apolline Dionysiac dualism, which of course he maintains is still prevalent in Germany. Now, there are three major flaws I find in Spengler's view of England. The first is that England's individualism grew out of a natural security, namely its island status. The second flaw being that the empire was nothing but a consecration of a materialist trading network. And finally, that because the Englishman did not follow in the path of German mysticism, his metaphysical state is one further deteriorated than that of the German. Let us look first at the national security question. That the security was God-given and not hard fought for by the Englishman is a fallacy. The Channel is scarce wider than the Rhine when it comes to geopolitical affairs. Did the British moat prevent the original invasion of the Anglo-Saxons or perturb William the Conqueror from establishing his lordship over an already established kingdom? England had fought for her security. This hard fight is coupled with her cultural phase. Spengler cites Goethe as a major influence on his work. But who was Goethe's major influence in turn, if not Shakespeare? The seas were not empty when Shakespeare was writing and England began announcing herself on the naval scene. The exploitations of Drake and Raleigh cannot come without provocation against the Spanish Habsburgs, though Luther had begun Germany's spiritual rebellion from Catholic Habsburg forces, political solutions regarding the Holy Roman Empire would lay muddled until 1648. So while England stuck her neck out in the 16th century, Germany was securely within the Holy Roman Empire, and this results in Germany's Kultur phase arriving later, only when Spanish Habsburg strength had waned away entirely following the War of the Spanish Succession. England, meanwhile, would continue to fight for the security of her island, which came through naval expansion and within the interior with the Acts of Union with Scotland, 1707. So seeing the Kultur phase then as a wider self-assertion phase, and the timing of Shakespeare and Spenser begins to make sense in the context of a Drake and a Raleigh. Indeed, it was Spenser and Raleigh who conversed to each other about literature and travelled to Ireland together to link the two forces of self-assertion. This is the kernel for naval British superiority centuries later. It is not a mere expansion of mercantilist enterprise, but is intrinsically tied to the cultural and self-asserting phase of England in the late 16th century and early 17th centuries. And this deals with our second flaw. Let's look then at the Germany of Spengler. Well, it is the Germany of Prussia rather than that of Austria. That's Spengler's mindset. And the self-assertion phase for him then would arrive with Frederick the Great. Now we begin to see the difference of English individualism and what Spengler deemed Prussian socialism, and it arrives as a result of the means of the assertion. Not that the self-assertion was granted naturally to England, or that Prussia's self-assertion was somehow more metaphysically bound to Spengler's own idea of history. Prussia, critically, has the self-assertion phase through land battles conducted by Frederick the Great. He is both king of the state and leader on the battlefield. But with England, her heroes lie in the navy, while the monarch, in the guise of Elizabeth originally, remains at home, and also a female monarch no less. What this does is it leads to a weakened idea of monarchy in the English mindset, and the enhanced role of rogue individual actors in the self-assertion phase, such as Drake, the plunderer. The self-assertion phase becomes more complicated in England because Elizabeth is left without heir, and England's stay-at-home monarchy weakens further, and it's not really until the Glorious Revolution of 1689 and the Acts of Union with Scotland, a few decades later, that she has a cohesive resolution to that self-assertion phase. Prussia's revolution is meanwhile confined entirely to the state apparatus under the will of Frederick the Great. So a leader from the top of the state apparatus is what initiated Prussia's self-assertion phase. Now to address the third flaw, that England had a more deteriorated metaphysical state than Germany. This was Spengler's view. Once the trouble of the 17th century has resolved, England is left with a dual metaphysical state, one that doesn't seem to be wholly understood by Spengler. We're left with a civilization that is at once both Faustian and Falstaffian. Christopher Marlowe gives us the Faustian drama in the English Kultur phase, just as Goethe shall do similar in the later German Kultur phase. And Marlowe can write about the great conqueror Tamburlaine and appeal to that want, which is intrinsic to all of the West, or the Abendlandes, to reach the infinite expanse, as Spengler points out. But Shakespeare, through his creation of Falstaff, gives us another aspect of the English. This is the stay-at-home aspect of the English psyche. And the importance of Falstaff was understood by many an English writer throughout history. And there exists a good interview with Orson Welles, who discusses it. And it was Welles who sought to capture its essence in his 1965 film Chimes at Midnight, an adaptation of Shakespeare's Henry IV, parts 1 and 2.
Falstaff, I think, is the most unusual figure in fiction, in that he is almost entirely a good man. He is a gloriously life-affirming good man, and there are very few gigantic silhouettes on the horizon of fiction who are good. They are always flawed. They are always interesting because of what is wrong with them. And Falstaff is, somebody once said that Falstaff was Hamlet who stayed in England and got fat, you know, which is amusing to think of, but I don't think it's true, because Hamlet is not a good man, I don't think. And there is hardly a good man in dramatic literature who dominates a whole scene, and Falstaff is, I think, really Merry England. I think Shakespeare was greatly preoccupied, as I am in my humble way, with the loss of innocence. And I think there has always been in England an older England, which was sweeter and purer, where the hay smelled better and the weather was always springtime, and the daffodils blew in the gentle warm breezes, and you feel the nostalgia for it in Chaucer, and you feel it all through Shakespeare. And I think that he was profoundly against the modern age, as I am. I'm against my modern age, he was against his. And I think his villains are modern people, just as they're likely to be continental. I always see the villains in Lear are non-Anglo-Saxon. They're from over there, and they represent the modern world, which includes gouging out eyes and sons being ungrateful to their fathers and all the rest of it. I think he was a typically English writer, archetypically the perfect English writer, in that very thing, that preoccupation with that Camelot, which is the great English legend, you know. And innocence is what Falstaff is. He is a kind of refugee from that world. And he has to live by his wits. He has to be funny. He has he hasn't a place to sleep if he doesn't get a laugh out of his patron. So it's a rough modern world that he's living in. But I think
It was understood by Tolkien, whose Shire is but a view of a wholly Falstaffian England, stripped of its Marlowe-Faustian nature. The church spire may be Faustian, as Spengler points out, but the true Englishman shall always picture that spire nestled amongst the rolling hills of his countryside. So Protestant Germany, in its latent culture phase, gives only Goethe with his Faust, just as it gave us only Frederick the Great on the battlefield. Whereas England, recall, gave us Elizabeth and Drake duality, and it also gave us Marlowe's Faust coupled with Shakespeare's Falstaff. The Falstaff mythos then remains with us to this day. It's there in the idea of the Little Englander. And it's there in the 2019 movie The King, which tries to merge the Henriade, Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V, all together into one film, a sort of Wells plus. In it, though, the role of Falstaff is elevated to the extent that he accompanies Henry as king to Agincourt, and helps mastermind his victory there. This latest adaptation goes against the standard path for Falstaff, that of stay-at-home England. The enterprising Englishman, for whom the word England meant at once England, Britain, and the Empire, put up a face to the foreigner, a front, a transition of character akin to Hal's transition into Henry V, when he gets crowned. It's that select, elevated Englishman whose duty it was to inherit a position of power within the imperial structure, and from there exert a regal austerity, similar to that we see in Henry IV Part 2. Hal, now newly crowned Henry V, must come to terms with Falstaff. He must turn to him and say the immortal words, "I know thee not, old man." This scene, in which Henry becomes king, asserts himself into maturity, and has to say goodbye to the earthly comforts of the Falstaffian existence, and play the role of the cold, calculating, analytical being on the international sphere. The scene, with the knowledge of what Henry was once and is destined to become, contains in it a unique insight into the character of old England.
Have you your wits? Know you what 'tis you say?
My king! My Joe! I speak to thee, my heart.
I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester. I have long dreamed of such a kind of man, so surfeit swelled, so old, and so profane. But being awaked, I do despise my